The hardest doors to walk through are usually the ones that promise you a place to belong. I kept repeating that sentence in my head as my old sedan rolled into the driveway of a weathered two-story house at the edge of a quiet neighborhood in Ashford, Ohio. Everything I still owned fit inside 2 cardboard boxes, 1 worn duffel bag, and the backpack resting on the passenger seat beside me. 3 weeks earlier, my apartment building in Columbus had been sold to a real estate company that planned to renovate every unit. We all received the same polite notice giving us 30 days to move. Rent prices had climbed far beyond what I could comfortably afford as a freelance graphic designer, and every affordable apartment disappeared almost as soon as it appeared online. After countless phone calls and disappointing viewings, I found a single furnished room listed at a price I could actually manage. The landlord lived on the property. The photographs showed a clean house, a quiet backyard, and a simple bedroom overlooking a row of maple trees. That was enough for me. I stepped out of the car, stretched my stiff shoulders, and reached for the first cardboard box. Before I could climb the front steps, the door opened. A tall man with broad shoulders, short dark brown hair, and serious gray eyes stood in the doorway. His expression never changed as he looked from my boxes to my face. "You must be Ethan Brooks," he said. His voice was calm, steady, and impossible to read. "That is me," I answered with a friendly smile. "Ryan Carter?" He nodded once. "Bring your things inside." The house smelled faintly of cedar wood and fresh coffee. Every piece of furniture sat perfectly in place. Shoes lined the entryway neatly. A framed landscape hung exactly level above a narrow table. It looked less like a home and more like a place where every detail had been carefully controlled. Ryan showed me the upstairs bedroom without wasting words. Bathroom across the hall. Laundry every Saturday. Kitchen closes at 10. Keep shared spaces clean. "That all sounds reasonable," I replied. He handed me a key before extending his hand. The final lease copy. I passed him the paperwork I had. Printed that morning. Ryan scanned each page silently until his eyes stopped near the emergency contact section. His jaw tightened almost immediately. He read one line again before lifting his gaze toward me. "This former emergency contact," he asked quietly. "He was your partner?" I did not believe in lying about who I was. "Yes," I answered honestly. "We broke up over a year ago." Ryan folded the papers with careful precision. "You should have mentioned that before moving here." I frowned slightly. Everything on the application was truthful. He looked directly into my eyes. "I do not rent rooms to gay men." The words landed harder than I expected, not because I had never heard something similar before, but because I had hoped I never would again. I glanced back toward my car, toward everything I owned sitting in plain view beneath the cloudy afternoon sky. "The lease has already been signed," I said as calmly as I could. "By both of us." Ryan remained silent for several seconds. Frustration crossed his face before disappearing behind the same guarded expression. "Legally, yes." He walked toward the living room window and stared outside. If I had known earlier, I never would have agreed. My chest tightened, but I refused to argue. I had spent too many years trying to convince strangers that kindness and honesty should matter more than assumptions. Those conversations rarely changed anyone. "I cannot leave," I admitted quietly. "I have nowhere else to go today." Ryan closed his eyes briefly before letting out a slow breath. "I keep my word," he finally said. "You can stay because I signed that contract." Relief barely had time to settle before he continued. "But do not mistake that for acceptance. We will live under the same roof. Nothing more. Keep your personal life private, respect this house, and stay out of mine." His words echoed through the quiet hallway. For a moment, I considered loading everything back into my car and driving until I found another solution. Then I looked around the room that was supposed to become my home, however temporary it might be. I carried my first box inside, placed it beside the bed, and looked back at Ryan with quiet determination. "I only came here looking for a place to start over," I said. Ryan reached for the bedroom door. "Then I hope you do not expect anything else." He stepped into the hallway and gently closed the door behind him. I stood alone in the unfamiliar room, surrounded by unopened boxes and complete silence, realizing that sometimes the greatest challenge is not finding a place to live, but learning how to survive inside a house where someone has already decided they do not want you there. The first week inside Ryan Carter's house taught me that silence could become its own language. Every morning he woke before sunrise, brewed exactly 1 cup of black coffee, washed the mug immediately after finishing, and left for work without saying more than a quiet morning. By the time I came downstairs with my laptop and notebook, the kitchen looked untouched, as though nobody had been there at all. Every cabinet door was perfectly aligned. Every chair rested neatly beneath the table. Even the newspaper was folded into a precise square. Ryan did not simply enjoy order. He depended on it. Before long, I realized the Rittenhouse rules were only the beginning. Shoes stayed beside the front door. Lights were turned off the moment someone left a room. The thermostat never moved beyond 68 degrees. The television remained silent after 9 each evening. None of those things bothered me. What stayed with me was the invisible rule Ryan never spoke aloud. He avoided me whenever possible. If we entered the hallway at the same time, he quietly stepped aside. If I wished him a good evening, he answered with the smallest nod before disappearing into another room. It felt less like hatred and more like he was carefully protecting an invisible line neither of us was supposed to cross. I buried myself in work. Most afternoons, I designed book covers and business logos from the small desk beside my bedroom window, while soft instrumental music played through my headphones. Whenever I needed fresh air, I walked several blocks to the local grocery store, where people greeted one another by name and strangers still held doors open. Mrs. Henderson, the elderly woman living next door, introduced herself during my second week with a warm smile and a plate of homemade oatmeal cookies. "Ryan is a good man," she said while handing me the plate. "He just forgot how to let people get close." I smiled politely without mentioning my first conversation with him. That evening, I placed several cookies on a small plate in the kitchen with a handwritten note that read, "Please enjoy." The next morning, the cookies were gone. The plate had been washed and returned to the cabinet, and my note had disappeared without a single word replacing it. Somehow that quiet response made me smile. One rainy Friday afternoon, I returned home carrying 2 grocery bags filled with soup, bread, fruit, and coffee. Just as I reached the front walk, one of the paper bags split open, sending apples rolling across the wet driveway. I sighed and knelt to gather everything before the rain ruined the groceries. Suddenly, another hand picked up one of the apples before it rolled beneath Ryan's truck. I looked up to find him standing beside me. Without saying anything, he bent down and collected the remaining fruit before lifting the heavier grocery bag from the ground. We walked toward the porch together in complete silence. Inside the kitchen, he carefully placed the bag on the counter and turned to leave. "Ryan," I called softly. He stopped, but did not face me. "Thank you." He remained still for a moment before answering in his calm, measured voice. "Do not misunderstand. I only helped because the groceries would have been wasted." Then he quietly walked upstairs. I watched him disappear around the corner, realizing that every small act of kindness seemed to frighten him almost as much as every honest conversation. As I unpacked the groceries, my eyes drifted toward the hallway where Ryan had vanished only moments earlier. Behind every rule, every careful routine, and every guarded silence, I sensed a story he had spent years trying to hide. And for reasons I could not yet explain, I had the feeling that whatever had happened to him long before I arrived was still shaping every decision he made today. The first cold wave of November arrived without warning, covering Ashford with gray skies and a steady drizzle that seemed determined to soak everything it touched. Nearly 3 weeks had passed since I moved into Ryan Carter's house, and although our conversations remained brief, something had quietly changed between us. The sharp edges of our first meeting had softened into cautious respect. Ryan still lived by his carefully structured routines, but every now and then he surprised me with a simple question about my work or a quiet comment about the weather. Those small moments never lasted long, yet they felt important because they came from someone who had spent so much effort keeping the world at a distance. One Tuesday afternoon, I heard Ryan's truck pull into the driveway nearly 2 hours earlier than usual. Curious, I glanced through my bedroom window and immediately noticed that something was wrong. He climbed out slowly, one hand resting against the truck for balance before making his way toward the front porch. His shoulders, usually straight and confident, seemed unusually heavy. I returned to my work, telling myself not to interfere, but less than 15 minutes later, I came downstairs for a glass of water and found him sitting alone at the kitchen table. His face looked pale, and an unopened bottle of cold medicine rested beside a grocery bag filled with soup, crackers, bottled water, and oranges. "Ryan, are you feeling all right?" I asked carefully. He nodded without lifting his head. Just tired. His voice sounded rough and strained. When he stood to put away the groceries, he paused halfway to the refrigerator and steadied himself against the counter. It lasted only a second, but it was enough for me to make up my mind. Please sit down, I said gently. I will take care of everything. You do not have to, he replied. Maybe not, I answered with a small smile. But I would like to. He hesitated before quietly returning to his chair. I unpacked the groceries, heated a container of chicken noodle soup on the stove, and filled a glass with water before placing everything in front of him. The kitchen remained silent except for the gentle sound of rain tapping against the windows and the soft bubbling of the soup. Ryan looked at the bowl for several moments before finally picking up the spoon. Thank you, he said quietly, almost as though the words had become unfamiliar after years of disuse. You are welcome, I replied. Everyone deserves someone to help when they are sick. He managed a faint smile that disappeared almost as quickly as it arrived. After several slow bites, he leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes for a moment. Someone used to make this, he murmured. I looked up from my coffee, but said nothing. A few seconds later, he spoke again, his voice barely louder than the rain outside. Daniel always insisted soup tasted better if someone else made it. The name caught me completely by surprise. Ryan opened his eyes, realizing what he had just said, and for a brief moment regret crossed his face. Instead of changing the subject, he simply stared into the steam rising from the bowl. I did not ask who Daniel was because something told me that question belonged to another day. Even without an explanation, I understood that the quiet house around us had not always been filled with silence. Somewhere in Ryan's past, someone named Daniel had once shared this kitchen, this table, and perhaps even the laughter that had long since disappeared. As the evening settled over the house, I realized the walls Ryan had built around himself were beginning to crack, not because I had tried to break them down, but because kindness had quietly reached places fear could no longer protect. Ryan recovered over the next several days, but something inside the house had quietly changed. The distance between us no longer felt sharp. It felt careful, as though we were both learning where old wounds ended and new trust could begin. He still spoke less than most people, yet every morning he now greeted me before leaving for work, and every evening he asked how my latest design project was going. The conversations remained short, but they were real. More importantly, they no longer felt forced. I never mentioned the name Daniel again. Whatever story belonged to that single word deserved to be told on Ryan's terms. Nearly a week later, on a rainy Saturday afternoon, I decided to clean the upstairs hallway while Ryan organized storage boxes in the garage. Several old cartons had been stacked beside the attic ladder since the day I moved in. Hoping to vacuum beneath them, I carefully lifted one of the smaller boxes. The worn cardboard suddenly gave way, spilling photographs, books, and old letters across the hardwood floor. Oh no, I muttered, immediately kneeling to gather everything before anything became damaged. One framed photograph slid several feet across the hallway before stopping beside the window. I picked it up instinctively. The picture showed a younger Ryan standing shoulder to shoulder with another man on a hiking trail surrounded by towering pine trees beneath a bright blue sky. They were smiling with the kind of effortless happiness that only appears when people forget a camera is watching. I gently turned the frame over. Written neatly across the back were the words, Yosemite National Park. The best weekend of my life. Love always, Daniel. Before I could return the photograph to the box, I heard footsteps approaching from the staircase. Ryan stopped the instant he saw the frame in my hands. For several long seconds, neither of us spoke. His face did not show anger. Instead, it reflected something far more painful. It looked like someone unexpectedly meeting a memory he had spent years trying to outrun. I am sorry, I said quietly. The box broke apart while I was cleaning. Ryan slowly accepted the photograph and looked down at it. His thumb traced the edge of the wooden frame before he let out a slow breath. His full name was Daniel Harper, he finally said. We met during a volunteer rebuilding project after severe flooding nearly 15 years ago. A faint smile appeared across his face. He could make complete strangers laugh within minutes. I usually needed weeks just to remember everyone's names. He gave a soft, almost embarrassed laugh before the smile faded again. We spent 4 years together. Almost nobody knew. We convinced ourselves that keeping everything private would make life easier. His eyes drifted toward the rain sliding down the hallway window. Then Daniel became seriously ill. Everything changed faster than I was ready for. He paused, searching for words that had clearly remained buried for years. After he was gone, I packed away every photograph, every letter, every memory that reminded me of him. I told myself I was moving forward, but the truth was much simpler. I was hiding. He finally looked directly at me, and I could see years of regret resting quietly behind his gray eyes. When you arrived at this house, I told myself I disliked people like you. He slowly shook his head. That was never true. I was angry because seeing you reminded me of the life I was too afraid to live after Daniel was gone. I convinced myself that pushing people away would protect me from ever feeling that loss again. The confession settled gently between us, carried only by the sound of rain against the glass. In that moment, I finally understood that Ryan had never built walls because he hated other people. He had built them because he believed they were the only thing keeping his broken heart from falling apart one more time. The conversation in the upstairs hallway quietly changed everything between us. Nothing dramatic happened overnight, yet the house no longer felt divided into two separate worlds. The same hardwood floors creaked beneath our footsteps. The same coffee filled the kitchen every morning, and the same maple trees stood outside the windows. But the silence had become comfortable instead of heavy. It felt as though we had finally stopped treating each other like strangers sharing an address. The following Sunday, I woke to the familiar aroma of coffee drifting upstairs. When I reached the kitchen, Ryan was standing at the stove making pancakes with surprising confidence. He glanced over his shoulder and gave me a small, almost uncertain smile. "There is enough for both of us if you are hungry," he said. It was such a simple invitation, yet it carried more meaning than any apology could have. I smiled as I reached for a plate. "I would like that. Thank you." We ate breakfast while soft morning sunlight spilled across the kitchen table. Our conversation stayed comfortably ordinary. Ryan asked how a logo design I had been working on was progressing. I asked about the fire safety classes he occasionally volunteered to teach at the community center. Neither of us tried to force deeper conversations. We simply enjoyed the quiet company. After breakfast, I carried my sketchbook onto the back porch and began drawing the old maple tree that shaded part of the yard. Ryan stepped outside with a toolbox and stopped beside my chair. He looked down at the sketch for several moments before speaking. "You notice details most people never see." I smiled without looking up from the page. "That is part of my job." Ryan nodded thoughtfully. "Daniel used to stop during hikes because he wanted to admire little things I always walked past. A strange-shaped rock, sunlight through the trees, wildflowers beside the trail." He laughed softly. "I always told him we would never reach our destination if he kept stopping." I looked at him. Maybe those moments were the destination. Ryan stood quietly for a second before smiling in a way I had never seen before. "He probably would have agreed with you." There was sadness in his voice, but it no longer sounded overwhelming. It sounded peaceful, as though remembering Daniel had finally become something gentle instead of something painful. That afternoon, Ryan asked whether I would help repair the aging wooden fence behind the house before winter became too harsh. We measured boards, replaced loose nails, and worked side by side for hours beneath a bright blue sky. At one point, I climbed a short ladder to tighten a loose hinge. The ground shifted slightly beneath one of the ladder legs, and before I could steady myself, Ryan stepped forward and held it firmly with both hands. "Take your time," he said calmly. "I have you." The words were simple, but they stayed with me long after I climbed down. As the sun began to set, we sat together on the back steps with 2 steaming mugs of coffee resting between us. Ryan watched the evening light stretch across the yard before quietly speaking again. "For years I believed moving forward meant pretending Daniel had never existed." He shook his head slowly. "Now I think the real mistake was believing that loving someone meant I had to stop living after they were gone." He turned toward me with quiet honesty. "Meeting you has made me realize there is a difference between honoring the past and hiding inside it." I met his eyes and answered softly, "You do not have to leave your memories behind to make room for new ones." Ryan looked across the yard once more before giving a gentle nod. "Maybe that is what I have been trying to learn all along." As the last sunlight disappeared behind the maple trees, I realized healing was rarely built through grand speeches or dramatic moments. Sometimes it began with pancakes on a quiet Sunday morning, repaired fences in a peaceful backyard, shared cups of coffee at sunset, and two people slowly discovering that trust often grows strongest in the ordinary moments neither of them expected to matter. The annual winter food drive had always been one of the biggest events in Ashford, bringing together nearly everyone in town inside the old fellowship hall beside the brick church. By early Saturday morning, volunteers were already unloading boxes of canned food, blankets, warm coats, and holiday supplies, while cheerful conversations filled the room. Ryan had participated every year since moving to Ashford, and earlier that week he quietly asked whether I wanted to volunteer beside him. I accepted immediately. We loaded several donation boxes into the back of his truck before driving through streets decorated with evergreen wreaths, white lights, and red ribbons hanging from nearly every front porch. The atmosphere inside the fellowship hall felt warm despite the cold weather outside. Children helped sort canned goods while older volunteers organized winter clothing for local families. Ryan greeted familiar faces with polite smiles, introducing me simply as Ethan whenever someone asked who I was. It was the first time he had introduced me without hesitation, and somehow that small detail stayed with me throughout the morning. We spent several hours arranging donations side by side, occasionally exchanging quiet jokes whenever we accidentally reached for the same box at the same time. It felt natural, easy, and peaceful. Shortly before lunch, one of Ryan's former co-workers named Mark walked over carrying 2 cups of coffee. He greeted Ryan warmly before noticing me standing nearby. "You must be the new tenant," he said with a friendly smile. "That is right," I replied, accepting his handshake. Mark glanced between Ryan and me before asking casually, "Your wife stayed home today?" I smiled politely. "I do not have a wife." "Girlfriend then?" he continued. I gently shook my head. "Neither." His expression shifted with mild surprise. "Oh." He laughed awkwardly before adding, "You just do not seem like that kind of guy." His words were not shouted or cruel, but they landed heavily enough that several nearby volunteers briefly looked in our direction. I had heard similar comments before, and normally I would have answered with a polite smile before changing the subject. Before I could speak, Ryan calmly stepped forward until he stood beside me. His voice remained steady, never raised, yet every word carried unmistakable conviction. "There is no such thing as looking like one kind of person or another," he said. Mark blinked in surprise. "I was only trying to make conversation." Ryan nodded once. "I believe you. But conversations should make people feel welcome, not uncomfortable." The room fell quiet for a brief moment before Mark lowered his eyes with genuine embarrassment. "You are right," he admitted. He turned toward me. "I am sorry, Ethan. I did not think before I spoke." I smiled gently. "Thank you. I appreciate that." The conversation moved on, and soon everyone returned to sorting donations, but my thoughts stayed fixed on Ryan. Only weeks earlier he had looked me in the eye and said he did not rent rooms to gay men. Now he had calmly defended me in front of neighbors who had known him for years. The change felt remarkable not because he had argued with someone, but because he had chosen honesty over silence. On the drive home, snowflakes drifted lazily across the windshield while the truck moved quietly through familiar streets. After several minutes I finally spoke. "You did not have to say anything back there." Ryan kept his attention on the road before answering. "Yes, I did." His voice sounded thoughtful rather than emotional. For a long time I believed staying silent kept life simple. The truth is that silence allowed fear to make too many decisions for me. He paused before continuing. "I cannot change the years I spent hiding from myself, Ethan, but I can decide that I will never again stay quiet when someone deserves better." I looked out the passenger window as the houses of Ashford slowly passed by, realizing that real courage rarely arrived in dramatic moments. Sometimes it revealed itself through one calm sentence spoken at exactly the right time, changing not only how another person was seen, but also how someone finally chose to see himself. Snow covered Ashford once again, turning familiar streets into quiet paths of white beneath a pale winter sky. The house felt warmer than ever, not because of the fireplace glowing softly in the living room, but because silence between Ryan and me had finally become peaceful instead of uncomfortable. We no longer avoided each other in the hallway. Morning coffee had become a shared routine, and every evening we somehow ended up talking longer than we planned. One Friday night, a winter storm swept across town, bringing strong winds that rattled the windows. Ryan added another log to the fireplace, while I carried 2 mugs of hot chocolate into the living room. We settled onto opposite ends of the couch, watching snowflakes drift past the front window without feeling any need to fill every quiet moment with conversation. After several minutes, Ryan finally spoke. "I have been thinking ever since the food drive." I turned toward him and waited. He stared into the flames before continuing. "When Mark apologized, I realized something that has been bothering me for years." His voice remained calm, but every word sounded carefully chosen. I was never truly angry with people like him. I was angry because I heard my own excuses in his words. He rested both hands around his mug. For years I convinced myself that keeping everyone at a distance would somehow protect me from being hurt again. Instead, it only guaranteed that I would stay alone. I listened without interrupting. Ryan slowly shook his head. "When Daniel died, I believed loving him had destroyed my future. That was never true. Losing him broke my heart. Fear kept it broken." His eyes finally met mine. "Then you walked through my front door carrying 2 cardboard boxes, and all I could see was another reminder of the life I had buried." He smiled sadly. "Now I understand that you were never a reminder of my pain. You reminded me that I was still capable of caring about another person." My throat tightened as I searched for the right words, but none seemed necessary. I reached across the space between us and gently rested my hand over his. Ryan looked down at our hands for several quiet seconds. This time he did not pull away. Instead, his fingers slowly closed around mine, almost as though they had been searching for that simple connection longer than either of us realized. The room remained silent except for the crackling fire. Ryan looked back into my eyes. "Meeting you changed the way I see myself," he admitted softly. "For the first time since Daniel, I do not feel guilty every time I imagine a future. My heart felt impossibly light." "You deserve that future," I answered. He smiled, but only for a moment. The expression faded as uncertainty returned to his face. Ryan slowly released my hand and stood from the couch. He paced once across the living room before stopping beside the front window. Snow continued falling beyond the glass. "I want to believe that," he whispered. "I truly do." He rested one hand against the window frame and closed his eyes. "But every time I take one step forward, part of me still believes I am leaving Daniel behind." I stood beside him without speaking. After several long moments, Ryan quietly reached for his winter coat, hanging near the front door. "I need some time to think," he said. "Not because of you. Because I finally have to stop running from myself." Before I could answer, he stepped outside into the softly falling snow. I watched him disappear beneath the streetlights until his figure faded into the white evening, realizing that the hardest journey Ryan had ever faced was no longer learning how to trust me. It was learning how to forgive the man he had spent so many years becoming. Ryan did not return until well after midnight. I heard the front door open while I was still awake, listening to the wind carry fresh snow against the windows. His footsteps paused outside my bedroom for only a second before continuing quietly down the hallway. Neither of us spoke the following morning. There was no tension between us, only the quiet understanding that some decisions could not be rushed, no matter how much 2 people wished they could. During the next several days, Ryan seemed unusually thoughtful. More than once I noticed him standing alone beneath the old maple tree in the backyard, his hands buried deep inside his coat pockets while he stared across the empty field beyond the fence. I never interrupted him. Whatever conversation he was having, it was not with me. It was with the memories he had carried for years. On Friday afternoon, Mrs. Henderson stopped by with a basket of homemade cinnamon rolls and reminded us that Ashford's annual Christmas tree lighting ceremony would take place the following evening. "The whole town will be there," she said with her usual cheerful smile. "It would be nice to see both of you." Ryan thanked her politely, but made no promises. Saturday evening arrived clear and cold. Main Street sparkled beneath thousands of white lights stretched between old brick buildings, and families filled the sidewalks carrying cups of hot chocolate while children laughed around small fire pits. Christmas music drifted through the crisp air as volunteers handed out cookies and warm cider beneath decorated tents. I walked through the crowd alone, quietly accepting that Ryan might not come. After everything we had shared, I understood that courage sometimes needed more than a single conversation. I found a place near the enormous evergreen in the center of the square, just as the mayor stepped onto the stage. The countdown would begin in only a few minutes. Even so, my eyes kept searching the edge of the street. Then I saw Ryan's truck pull into a parking space across from the square. The engine stopped, but he remained inside. Minutes passed. Families continued gathering while the sky slowly darkened above the glowing decorations. Ryan stayed behind the steering wheel, his hands resting motionless as though every breath required a decision. Nearly 20 minutes slipped by before the driver's door finally opened. He stepped into the cold evening, closed the door, and stood beside the truck for a moment with his eyes fixed on the celebration ahead. Then he took one slow breath and began walking toward me without hesitation. When he reached my side, he smiled with nervous honesty. "I almost drove home 3 different times," he admitted. "Fear kept telling me I was not ready." I looked at him gently. "But you came anyway." He nodded. "Because I finally realized I will never be ready if I keep waiting for fear to disappear." The mayor began counting backward as the crowd joined together. 3, 2, 1. The towering Christmas tree burst into brilliant light, filling the square with a warm golden glow that reflected across smiling faces and freshly fallen snow. At that exact moment, Ryan reached for my hand. His fingers slipped naturally between mine, calm and certain, without looking around to see who might be watching. He met my eyes with a quiet confidence I had never seen before. "I spent years believing love was the reason my life fell apart," he said softly. "The truth is that fear made every important decision for me after Daniel was gone. I will not let fear decide another one." He smiled through eyes that carried both sadness and hope. "I cannot change my past, Ethan, but I can choose the future standing beside me." I gently squeezed his hand, and for the first time since I arrived in Ashford, I realized Ryan was no longer hiding behind silence, regret, or guilt. Standing together beneath thousands of Christmas lights while the town celebrated around us, he had finally chosen honesty over fear, and somehow that single quiet choice illuminated far more than the tree rising above us. Spring arrived gently in Ashford, washing away the last traces of snow and replacing bare branches with fresh green leaves that shimmered beneath warm afternoon sunlight. Looking around the backyard one morning, I realized the house no longer felt like Ryan Carter's house where I happened to rent a room. Somewhere between long winter evenings, shared breakfasts, and countless ordinary conversations, it had quietly become our home. My freelance design business continued to grow, and the upstairs bedroom slowly transformed into a bright little studio where ideas seemed to arrive as naturally as the morning light pouring through the windows. Ryan accepted a permanent position teaching fire safety classes at the community center. Watching him patiently encourage children and answer endless questions with quiet kindness, it became impossible to imagine that this was the same man who had once believed keeping everyone at a distance was the safest way to live. One Saturday morning, we decided to repaint the old front porch before summer arrived. Mrs. Henderson appeared carrying a basket of warm blueberry muffins, smiling as though she had expected us to need both breakfast and encouragement. Throughout the afternoon, neighbors wandered over to admire the fresh paint, exchange stories, and welcome the warmer weather. Every time someone introduced themselves to me, Ryan stood beside me without hesitation. "This is Ethan," he would say with an easy smile. "He makes this place feel like home." Hearing those words never became ordinary. They reminded me how far both of us had traveled since the afternoon he had nearly asked me to leave before I even unpacked my first box. Later that evening, we organized the garage together. While moving several old storage bins, Ryan found the framed photograph of himself and Daniel that had once remained hidden inside a dusty cardboard box. He held it quietly for several moments before looking toward me. "I think it belongs inside the house again," he said softly. Together, we carried the photograph into the living room and placed it on the bookshelf where sunlight from the front window gently touched the frame. Ryan smiled peacefully at the picture. "For years, I believed loving Daniel and moving forward could never exist together," he admitted. "Now I understand that remembering someone with gratitude does not prevent your heart from growing again." I slipped my hand into his, and he squeezed it gently without taking his eyes off the photograph. A few weeks later, we planted 2 young maple trees beside the repaired fence in the backyard. We worked quietly beneath a bright blue sky, laughing whenever the loose soil refused to stay where we wanted it. After packing the last shovel of earth around the roots, Ryan leaned on the shovel handle and admired the 2 small trees standing side by side. One day they will be taller than this house, he said. I smiled. And someone else will enjoy their shade long after we are gone. Ryan nodded thoughtfully. Kindness works the same way, does not it? I looked around the yard, the porch we had painted together, the fence we had repaired, and the home that had slowly healed 2 lonely lives. Nothing about the building itself had truly changed. The same front door still opened onto the same hallway. The same windows still welcomed the morning sun. The greatest transformation had happened inside the people living there. Home had never been built from walls, furniture, or carefully written house rules. It had been built one conversation at a time, one act of compassion after another, and one courageous decision to trust again. If someone had told me on the day I arrived with 2 cardboard boxes that the man who once believed there was no place for someone like me under his roof would one day become the person I trusted most, I would have smiled politely and assumed they were mistaken. Yet standing beside Ryan beneath the gentle spring sky, watching 2 young maple trees sway together in the breeze, I finally understood that fear can build walls around a house, but only kindness can ever transform that house into a home.